Oh, we all should be good to go here. Merrily on high. This time we're looking at chapters 7 and 8, which is the Navy and at sea. So he's going to join the Navy. And in fact, that's how he concludes the last chapter 6. I simply woke up one morning and said to myself, I'm going to join the Navy. That's how it always works. But he, it was wartime, so we're in the midst of World War II, and, all the boys are getting called up, and everybody's going off to war, and more and more he feels like I need to do my part, and so he signs up with the Navy. And he remarks in the beginning that the office of chaplain in the Navy is a rank in itself, and is given great marks of outward respect. And of course, I was thinking about the details of this, and I'm not all that familiar with a lot of military stuff, and also, but this is the military of a country that has a state church. So I'm also curious, he doesn't mention, but how does that affect things? So for example, are there any non-Anglican chaplains? Or is it all Anglican, or what? So there's religious toleration that has come about in stages over the course of history in England. But I'm not quite aware of the ins and outs of that. Do you have any insight into that?
No, but backing up, I was going to ask, do you have any idea whether he would have received an exemption as a priest?
I think he mentioned something like that in chapter 6.
Okay.
Yeah, that he didn't have to go, or it's back when he was at Oxford, and so the war is starting, and everybody's kind of like, well, what do we do now, and so he decides instead of signing up, he'll just kind of go into the parish, and I think if he's an actively serving minister of the gospel, then he's exempt from the draft. Mm-hmm. But if he's ordained but not doing anything official, then he wouldn't be exempt, I guess. But even at the very beginning, he's kind of like, well, what should I do? And he decides to go ahead and sign up. And I reminisced last time that when it was in my middle year at seminary that 9/11 happened. Mm. And I remember watching the first tower fall down in New York, and I don't know if I said it out loud, but I remember thinking it in my head at least, I guess we're going to war. It's just kind of inevitable. And he talks about that kind of inevitability as the war begins and progresses, and it kind of went from, well, this is not going to really go anywhere, to it's obviously going to consume everything, and there's no way to get around it. We are all part of the war effort. The war is coming here, kind of thing, which is so different from all our experiences of war. I think it was the last Corpus Christi, Christ the King, where I posed the question in the sermon, is America at war? And I was like, I don't know the answer to that question. And I kind of went back and forth, like, well, I can say for this reason it is, and for this reason it's not. So our experience of war is so different from this, because the war for us, at least for the past, well, when would be the last one? I don't know, the Spanish or the Mexican War, the Civil War. That would be the last time that the war was here, except for Pearl Harbor. But, even that is there. It's American soil, but it's halfway across the Pacific. So for us, in the 20th century, war is always way over there. Mm-hmm. So we're involved and engaged, but, it's not the same. But it's just gotten more and more removed as time has gone by. So, back in World War II like this, you had the Victory Garden, and you had rationing and all that kind of stuff that you experience in a total war effort. But now you don't even, you would have no clue whatsoever whether we're at war or not by looking around. But anyway, that's an aside. So he signs up. He's a chaplain in the Navy. He didn't say why he chose the Navy, but that just seems to be his kind of de facto outlook on life. Perhaps it's a family connection. Perhaps it's just the Navy seems to be the coolest, or who knows. Or he had always liked the sea. And I wish he had talked a little bit more about the church-state kind of connection. But he's not writing primarily with Americans in mind. And so you'll find several times in this chapter he makes allusions that people will get who are his contemporaries and in England, but which pass a little bit over our heads. He mentions that they are in Portsmouth to start with, if I'm saying that right. Portsmouth, okay. I figured it was something along those lines. And he mentions that, originally that was expected to be a big, booming residential area, and then it turned out not to be. And it was basically consumed by industrial type of buildings. And the parishes became kind of extinct there. In fact, there's one surviving famous parish, I'm sure there's more, but there was one in this situation, St. Agatha's, I think it is, or if it's not Agatha, maybe it's Agnes, Portsmouth. It was a redundant church and closed, and then some continuing Anglicans bought it. And it's a kind of a charming little English church, kind of a medium-sized building. So it's not a little country church, but it's not a huge cathedral either. Well, hello, Marianne. Welcome. Glad to have you here. So St. Agnes's or Agatha's, Portsmouth, they bought the building, and it still had, the churchy stuff about it. It hadn't been turned into a nightclub, or something like that. And so they kind of, it was something that nobody wanted. So they were kind of free to open it up, and they had a congregation just by the fact that, the few and far between scattered continuing Anglicans, which never really caught on over there, could come there from all over. And they kind of accumulated a little, almost museum of artifacts from other redundant churches that were closed, or perhaps Roman Catholic places that were, tossing out stuff because it wasn't the fashion anymore. So you find all these, big crucifixes and statues and kind of, it's a little hallway of shrines. And then the last I heard is that it became attached to the ordinariate and officially became an ordinariate parish, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But that is the kind of lay of the land here in Portsmouth. And he goes to church on Sundays at St. Michael and All Angels there. And it had been, in the day, a famous Anglo-Catholic parish, he says, but it had kind of fallen victim to the changing demographics it was just dockyards. And so he says it was kind of depressing. Page 104, I found it a depressing building with its empty tabernacle and untended shrines, all relics of its vanished past. So the dockyard had swallowed up its congregation, but it was still there as a shell of itself. And then speaking of, the shells, Portsmouth and Southsea were in such a terrible state from the bombing, and the two famous churches had been destroyed. St. Agatha's Landport, where Father Doling had fought his battles, was a heap of ruins, and almost incredibly, for it seemed to me as far away as the Dark Ages, his successor, Father Coles, was still there, conducting services in one of the ruined chapels. Someone who'd been his curate told me that he would never give any idea of what he was to do on Sunday. Oh, he's kind of changing gears here. So Father Coles is still holding church in a bombed-out building, but that happened. And I have a great picture that I love of a church in I think it's somewhere in Germany, one of the big cathedrals, and there's a big hole in the side of the wall there, and they're having solemn high mass on Easter Sunday or something like that. But it's whatever they got. There's a great scene in the movie Valkyrie, where Tom Cruise, his character is praying in a church, and he ends up talking with somebody else, and they're conspiring to kill Hitler, and so there's this conversation of whispers in churches, and it's kind of a safe place to rendezvous to talk. And then they sort of pull back the shot, and you can see that like part of the roof is missing because it's been bombed out. But people are still there and praying and making use of the space. So that's far removed from our experience. Well, anyway, personality-wise, Father Coles is a little bit, he's got some holes in him as well, because he says he would never give any thought to what to do on Sunday until late Saturday evening. And then about 10 p.m. on Saturday night, he would call up the stairs, "Will you say Mass at 8 and preach at 11 tomorrow, Father, please?" And I've known clergy over the years who kind of throw it together at the last minute strategy about life. So to all the people who are discerning whether to ordain people in the first place, those habits continue on. They don't, if someone's life is totally unruly and disorderly, ordination doesn't fix that. It was one of the professors put it, we should not confuse two sacraments of ordination and anointing of the sick. So
No.
And it says that the church, another church, St. Matthew's, Southsea, also lay in ruins, and Mass was said in the sacristy with one of the counters for the altar. And then he talks about kind of enculturation, about the middle of page 105. There were a lot of naval establishments around Portsmouth for which the chaplains at the barracks were responsible, and on Sundays I took services at some odd places. And I wonder he doesn't say if this is kind of a wartime situation where the chaplains at the base there have kind of stepped up in sort of a cooperation with the community, or if it's always been that way. I don't know. He says, I remember saying Mass in the Stokers' school, where the table for the altar had been rigged against a wall, which had some of the most filthy pictures I've ever seen outside a public lavatory scribbled on it. It seemed to be a very curious reredos for the celebration of the Holy Mysteries, but I would have no doubt that today the more with-it clergy would regard it as a perfect way of bringing everyday life into religion, rather than vice versa, which my old-fashioned generation thought the right way around. So he would have thought it more appropriate to bring religion into the secular sphere rather than to bring the secular elements into the religious sphere. So his example of enculturation was church services being held in a very unfitting place. He talks about early on, he preached from notes or a full-fledged script. And then he says on page 106, once I joined the Navy, I discovered that the only recipe for preaching, if one wanted to hold the attention of one's congregation, was to stand up, speak up, and shut up. In sequence, I guess. Since then, I have seldom taken a manuscript into the pulpit with me. Of course, I forget half the things I intend to say, but this is no bad thing. A priest once said to me, I don't mind people looking at their watches while I'm preaching, but I do object to them shaking them to see if they've stopped. And so my personal thing is I have preached from a script mostly on Sundays. Every now and then I have tried just an outline. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, I was part of a online webinar put together by Barna, and they're the Christian survey group, and they do all this data analysis and stuff like that. And so they were doing a presentation on the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And surprisingly, millennials, the youngest age group, preferred the longest sermon time. So they had, sermon time preference by age group. Mm-hmm. And so the oldest was the shortest, and the youngest was the longest, which is kind of exactly the reverse of what I would have expected, mm-hmm. because over time, people's attention spans have dropped. So guess how long it was for the millennials? And this is the average. So they would give responses, they'd probably check different, 5-minute increments or whatever.
30 minutes?
45 minutes.
Wow.
I was kind of blown away, and I was thinking about that, thinking, how does that make any sense? But I think perhaps it relates to basically podcasting, because people will listen to things, a podcast on their phone or watch it on their computer or something like that, and those will be half hour to an hour, typically. And so I think that's probably what it is that they've kind of synced up to that rhythm. And of course, in our arrangement, I would never preach for 45 minutes. I wonder what the longest sermon I've given was. I know what it was, I just don't know how long it was. So the longest probably I've ever given was to an SSC chapter meeting. In fact, I started the sermon by saying, get comfortable, you're going to be here for a while. And so it was probably like 25, maybe 30 minutes. And the thing is, you can talk as long as you want if you're holding people's attention. I mean, if you're not holding people's attention, you've gone too long, no matter how short it is, So that's just kind of how it works. But I remember being preached to as a child for 40, 45 minutes. And the church that I went to as a child, it's gotten shorter. It's probably down to 30 minutes for a sermon.
But isn't it isn't it more likely to be longer when it is maybe the focal point of the service?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's part of it too, is that if you're basically there for a Bible study on Sunday morning, then it tends to be longer. And I found that if it's longer, I will preach from a outline. So basically, I kind of use that for like doing a class. So I'll prepare an outline for a class. And not a whole script, except when I'm doing more of a video for like a long-term thing, I want to have it all right. But I am not good going without at least notes or an outline, because it's not so much that I forget things, which I do. The problem is that I get off course. So if I'm keeping it short and I've only got 1 or 2 points to make in just 2 or 3 minutes, that's fine. But if I go longer than that, I tend to forget where I'm going, and I've kind of wandered off somewhere, and I'm like I'm just babbling, trying to remember where I started and where I'm going. So I got to have something, because I'm just not built that way. He talks about on page 107 here, sort of reality. The HMS Penelope was in the dockyard being refitted, and we knew that one of us would be appointed as her chaplain, and I think we all hoped that we might be the one chosen. It was in fact a death sentence, for she later was torpedoed and sank with all hands, including the chaplain. So you never know exactly what to expect and how things are going to turn out, but you can be grateful when sometimes you're disappointed. So he says, I was bitterly disappointed because I joined the Navy because I wanted to go to sea, not just hang out at the dock. And so he says, it didn't take me long to learn that to serve with the Royal Marines in one of their own barracks was a very rare experience, and that I was indeed very lucky. So he was assigned to the Royal Marine Barracks at Eastney, and he hated the idea because he wanted to go on ship, and instead he got a new land job. But he found out this is really a treat.
Have you kept up enough to figure out how old he is at this time?
Well, I forgot, does he say when he's born? I'm thinking 1920, but that doesn't seem to fit. I need to go back and look that up so I can kind of write it down and have it at the front, keep it in mind. So we're probably to, I don't know, maybe about 1940 or just before that. So I would imagine he's probably in his mid to late 20s, because he hadn't been ordained for too long before this. He goes from his curacy to the Navy. So men would be typically ordained between 25, 27. The Episcopal Church had a minimum age of, I think, 25 or 6. I forget exactly. I was 27. But I could have gone 2 years earlier. So I could have been 25, so that's probably the minimum, which is basically just kind of straight through college and into seminary. He talked about one of his friends here, Father Jack Wilson, another chaplain, a rather fearsome figure whose severe poker face hid one of the most humorous and affectionate natures I've ever known. Middle of page 108. He would say the most devastating things as asides to me when we were both in church together, and the congregation, if they saw his lips move at all, would have thought from his face that he was making some pious comment. When we were saying the office together, he would end a lesson from Job by saying in a liturgical voice, "And I am sure we are both very much the wiser." And that made me think back to high school and being involved in church camp. And this was back in my evangelical, non-denominational Protestant days. And for whatever reason that eludes me, I jumped in and volunteered as one of the backup singers for the band. It was leading worship. And we quickly came to the realization that we were there singing at the top of our lungs, right into microphones, but nobody could tell what we were singing. It just didn't show up because people heard their own voices and they heard the instruments and all the amplification and stuff like that. So there was this song, he goes where I go, he feels where I feel, kind of picking up on Jesus journeys with me through life kind of thing. So somebody came up with the idea that the word watermelon would basically fit the meter of every line. So that's what we did. So we sang, watermelon, watermelon, and nobody noticed. And we were singing it
You sneaky little thing.
top of our lungs into microphones. And so you find a lot of that. And some of it is appropriate and some of it is not really appropriate. Some of it's just a kind of a immaturity. But it's probably of a par of kind of grim humor that you find in hospitals where people are kind of just trying to deal with the monotony or the stress or various things like that. On page 109, he talks about, and he doesn't really get into the details, but it's part of the background. He alludes to the practices of communion in those days. He says, the thing that worried us most, the chaplains, was that hardly a man ever came to communion on Sunday. The reason was not hard to discover, for the barrack rooms were scrubbed out at that time, and while those wanting to go to church could get permission to go, it was not hard to imagine what their fellows who were left scrubbing away said about it. So usually, typically, like the communion service would be at 8 o'clock or something like that. And so you would have 2 masses on a Sunday, and the early one would be to go to receive communion. And then the later one would be to go to worship. So that's where you would have the choir and the incense and all the fancy stuff where it'd go on forever. And he had mentioned that before in one of the previous chapters about Brighton. But here he's kind of alluding to that. So basically nobody would go to the 8 o'clock communion service and take communion because that's the hour when they were supposed to be scrubbing out the barracks. So he had an idea, well, I'll do one earlier than that. So this says the barrack routine was as unchangeable as the laws of the Medes and the Persians. So the only solution was to rig an altar in my office and have an early mass before the cleaning began. Of course, The real answer would have been to have an evening mass, but in those days we behaved as if it were better for people not to receive the sacrament at all than sacrifice the sacred principles of fasting communion. And he talks about, I would sometimes go through great stomach discomfort rather than break the fast. And it used to be that you couldn't even drink water, that water was considered breaking the fast, which I find unbelievable because as someone, who's leading worship and needs to wet my whistle to not just destroy my vocal cords, I'm like, how could you do that? I don't understand how you could even practically get through multiple liturgical enterprises. Of course, you're also talking about the day when the congregation was pretty much detached from things going on at the altar. So you didn't need necessarily to project your voice very much. And, you'd also run through these masses in a very short period of time. So 25 minutes maybe for not counting the time it takes to distribute communion, which may add another 10 or 15 minutes. But so I guess it could be doable, but not necessarily practical. In the middle of page 109, he talks about every week there was an intake of newly enlisted men, and those who said they were Church of England were marched for an interview with me. I had never before realized how pagan England had become. When I asked if they'd been baptized, as like as not, they would say that they had their mark on their left arm, which I guess they're talking about, I got my booster shot. I thought that's what you were talking about. So they don't even know what he's talking about when he asked if they'd been baptized. Also, I wonder if he had said, have you been christened? If that might have registered, because every now and then I encounter people who are confused about, is there a difference between baptism and christening? Like, oh yeah, you christen the babies, but you baptize the adults. No, it's the same thing. Although it also is a little bit confusing because often we use the term christen as basically just mean name something, and like I christened this ship.
Oh, yeah.
The Titanic or something. And that's because you're supposed to name the child in the baptismal service, hence christening. That's where it comes from. But it's about turning somebody into a Christian. That's what christening really is. In page 110, he goes back to this longing to get to sea. So he says, I was constantly urging Jack, his chaplain friend, to get me to sea, not because I was unhappy, but people went out from the barracks and returned having done all sorts of exciting things. And I felt that I had just sat on my bottom in an office and said grace at the weekly guest night, which was carried out with full ceremonial, the table loaded with trophies and the vast band playing away in the gallery. At last, marching orders came for both of us. I was to report to Glasgow to be the chaplain of a new cruiser, and Jack was to go to the top of the list as chaplain of the fleet, where he needed every ounce of humor in him to keep him sane. So he takes a train up to Scotland, to Glasgow, to board the HMS Ceylon, if I'm saying that right. So Ceylon is now known as Sri Lanka. And so as a part of the British Empire, so this boat, this cruiser was named after Ceylon. And I don't think it's part of the British Empire anymore. I'm not sure. But liturgically, or ecclesiologically, it is still an extra provincial territory under the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he has a couple of those, just only like 2 or 3, and that's one of them. And it's also unique because it used to be that missionary districts were all under the Bishop of London. And I don't know why historically it worked out that way, but that's the way it was. So like all of America and Canada was under the Bishop of London when they were colonies and so on. And so the Bishop of London had a whole lot more on its plate than the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Archbishop of York. So Sealeon is still extra-provincial to Canterbury and doesn't have any other oversight. It's not a self-governing church just because it's not big enough. It's a small island. I think maybe there's 2 dioceses. The population is only 7% Christian, and I don't know what percentage of that is Anglican, but I think the church there is numbered like 50,000 people or something. But they also have a lot more institutional leverage than is just relatable to their numbers because they were part of the British Empire. So there's a lot of Anglican schools there and things like that. So he talks about arriving in Scotland and, a dreary, typical Scottish weather, drizzly and so on. When he gets there, he's too early, so they say, well, sorry, Padre, why don't you go wait in the officers' club? And so he goes and waits until they tell him, and then he comes back and says, oh, sorry, Padre, she set sail. You missed it. Why don't you go back to the club, and we'll see if we can figure out what's going on here. So that time he's like, well, I don't want to go back because I feel like I'm going to miss something if I just go hang out. I'm going to stay here until you sort this thing out. So he arranges to find out where they're going and to follow up with them so he can board the ship further on down the line. So she was heading for the Isle of Arran. I'm not sure where that is. So he catches up with the HMS Ceylon there. He says his cabin was a large one off the marine mess deck. And I soon had a sign reading "The Vicarage" on the door. But once we headed to the tropics, it would have been more accurate to have Hades written on it, for it was unbearably hot, and I spent as little time there as possible. So that seems to be one of the perks of being a chaplain is, first of all, you have your own room, and it seems to be sizable. He said, my cabin was a large one. So the chaplain is his own rank, and that's intentional so that he can kind of relate to everybody and not, basically he has no rank in a sense. Being a chaplain is its own rank. And that's so he can be accessible to all the men, and especially in an English context where it's not just about rank, but also about class. So you have to be able to straddle class as clergy. He talks about the kind of characters that the captain and the commander are. He says the commander was a complete Baron Munchausen, but in all his tall stories, he got enough of the true facts to make it difficult to sort out the fictional elements. So he had several roles he delighted to play. The naval hero, who in command of a destroyer had almost completely been responsible for the evacuation of Dunkirk. The great inventor, who had produced the idea behind most of the scientific achievements since the beginning of the war. And the champion amateur jockey and polo player, whose exploits had become a legend. So he's a very charming fellow. And he realized, as he's getting into the personalities of the captain and the commander, that he has found his real ministry on this boat, which is to be a mediator between the two of these strong personalities. So he says, I soon found myself being a buffer state between the two of them and was witness of some fantastic scenes. He says there's a very historic photograph of them both at the commissioning ceremony for which they are both smiling, and I think it's doubtful if they ever smiled again in each other's company for the 3 years they served together. And that's how it is in a lot of cases with ministry, but I'm sure with any other job you take, you read through that job description and it says one thing, but then you find out once you get started that, oh, I'm going to be doing something totally different, Or at least what I thought would be important is not all that important, and so on. He says there's no chapel on board. Oh, I wanted to go look this up and I forgot. because I thought I remember reading in Ritual Notes or one of those kinds of books that you're really not supposed to ever say Mass on a boat. But I don't know if that's, you know, if you were ever given specific exceptions, like, okay, if it has an established chapel, then you can do that, or what. But, I mean, those kinds of rules are bent all over the place, and especially in wartime. So you see historic pictures of, like, a chaplain, you know, out in a battle zone saying Mass on a rock or on the hood of a Jeep or something, you know. So you see all kinds of exceptions, because Mass is not supposed to be said outside of a church. And then they kind of got around the rule by coming up with the idea of a portable altar. And so actually I've seen an online seller who makes these and designs these, where it's kind of like a briefcase, but it's made of wood. So you sort of open it up, and you know, the open part of the briefcase is the backdrop with the crucifix and stuff, and then a marble altar stone sits into the wood bottom, and so that's kind of your little makeshift portable altar, where you can set it up anywhere and have it be legal, because it adheres to all the formal requirements. So I'm a little fuzzy about the whole thing about you're not supposed to say Mass on a boat. But anyway, maybe I can track that down for next time. So he says this is a new ship, and when the whole putting together of the layout, they never bothered to specify a chapel. So there's kind of this war, turf war, of these different departments trying to claim space. And so he, of course, is fighting for a chapel. So at first he has to use his own room, and then he finds, well, there's the admiral's cabin, which is vacant because they don't usually have an admiral, but they have a special room for him. So like, okay, I'll take that. And then there's another larger space that he gets later on, where he can fit 30 or 40 people there. He's talking about the commander on page 113. He says that he played up to any part that was expected of him. When a bishop came aboard, he said in an emotional voice, "Our chapel is only a little place amidships, but the life of the whole ship revolves around it." The bishop said to me afterward, "You are lucky having a commander who was such a keen churchman." And I had to confess that I had never seen him in the chapel.
Did he have to confess that? Did he really?
He had to confess. He just couldn't keep it in. So he was using the Admiral C cabin on page 114. In the final share out, I got a better deal than I expected. And the chapel was big enough to hold 30 or 40 people. So this is like some kind of empty deck where they would have carried aircraft. So this is not an aircraft carrier, but this is a smaller ship, bigger than a destroyer. So it's kind of in the middle. So I think this aircraft, they wouldn't have launched from there, but they would be transporting aircraft. So this space was just going to be empty, so they kind of divvied it up for use among different departments. He said, one chaplain I knew said Mass in Latin. Wait a minute. This was much better than I expected. Often a chapel was little more than a cupboard deep in the bowels of the ship. One chaplain I knew always said Mass in Latin, for the engines made such a noise that he claimed no one could hear a word he was saying in any case. Then he talked about the king came to make a visit, George VI, at the home fleet, and all the chaplains were required to leave their own flocks and provide a living reredos in the cinema on the Isle of Flotta, where the monarch was to worship God. We all sat in rows wearing scarf and hood, and I had on a rather, I don't know that word. Outre. Was that fantastic? Amazing?
Kind of.
Curious?
Out of bounds.
Out of bounds.
Sort of
that would fit.
I think the ooch is like, it's related to our out.
Exotic. Version of an Oxford MA hood, which had been designed by Alex Lawson to look as much like a Roman mozzetta as possible, with scarlet buttons down the front. Now, it doesn't come with buttons. He added those himself. And I have one of those same hoods. I guess he's talking about what is referred to as the Warham Guild design. But it says it was designed by Alex Lawson, but it's not really original to him. It's going back to an earlier version of the academic hood. So the Warham Guild hood is the earlier version, the medieval version of the academic hood. So it's basically the same thing you find in a monastic garb, where you have an elbow-length shoulder cape with a built-in cowl hood at the back. And that's what the mozzetta is. The mozzetta and the academic hood basically have the same origin in monastic garb. So you would have like the Dominicans or the Benedictines or whatever, and they would have their white or black hood that's a part of their habit. And so as an academic degree, they would give them the same thing, but it would be in fancy cloth. So it would be in silk and colored wool, and the main dominant color would represent the degree, and then the lining would be the institution that it came from. So University of Paris or Oxford or wherever. So like my hood is purple because that's the divinity degree, and then the lining is red because that's the color of the school. And it's got this kind of big flap on the back, which is sort of a remnant of a hood. You could pull it up over, but it wouldn't quite look right. It sort of evolved slightly, but it basically kept on evolving. So, in the front, it would come down to the elbows, and basically that got shorter and shorter until it was only like, an inch in the front, and then everything just spilled down the back.
Okay.
So that's what you see now as the academic hood. It was originally meant to basically be the same length in the front and the back, and then all the colored lining stuff is basically the inside of the hood. So he talks about, he intentionally got one of these Warham Guild hoods, and that wasn't even good enough. He wanted to really make it look ecclesiastical, like a mozzetta. A mozzetta is a garment of jurisdiction. So it used to be that bishops could only wear the mozzetta in their own diocese, in their own jurisdiction. And then I think it was Paul VI changed it so that they could wear it anywhere, or that they should wear it anywhere. Made it as just if you're a bishop, you wear a mozzetta. And then there's other kind of lesser, if you're canon, you have a special mozzetta or different things like that. But it always has buttons up the front. So he had his own string of red buttons. So I thought, maybe one day I'll take my academic hood and I'll put on a string of red buttons and people will think it means something. Well, King George thought it meant something. So he says the king wanted to know about this. After the service, the whole proceedings were held up as the king asked to see me and wanted to know what my hood was. And he said he couldn't take his eyes off it during the service. All round, admirals were pawing the ground with impatience as I tried to explain that when men wore wigs in the 18th century, the hole had to be made big enough to go over their heads. The king listened intently. But all those buttons down the front, he asked? Well, those, I was forced to admit, are a bit of nonsense of my own. He laughed and moved on with the carefully timed program, to which this interlude had been an unexpected interruption. My captain told me that after this, several people had said to him, I hear you've got a cardinal as chaplain on your ship. And he was rather pleased about that. So he got his own chapel put together, and he said this was the first chapel I ever had the opportunity of putting together, not counting his amateur attempts in Henfield. Most of the fittings were made by tradesmen on the ship. The altar had been a proper stone altar procured by Bertha Travers of Pax House, and it was made as a cupboard to hold frontals and other gear, and then the credence table was made as a vestment chest with drawers. So both of them were practical pieces of furniture. So they looked like an altar and a credence table on the outside, but then they had stuff to store everything on the inside. And usually, it's if you got a wooden altar especially, you'll see that the back is open, that it's kind of unfinished on the back. And then it's always kind of funny to go to a different church and to peek around the corner and see if there's anything back there. Sometimes it'll be sort of just junk or odds and ends. The most practical thing was a fire extinguisher back there. I'm like, okay, note to self, if you're ever in that situation, it's a good idea. Keep a fire extinguisher back there. I decided to put one in the pulpit in Dublin because it was the most practical spot to put it to kind of hide it out of view and yet have it accessible. Because it dawned on me one time, like, this is a wood building from the 1800s, and there is no fire extinguisher in this whole building, on this whole property. And if it goes up in flames, it goes up in flames. So immediately we added fire extinguishers. He talks about in his chapel there was a large tabernacle and 4 altar candles. As a shrine of Our Lady, I had a picture of Our Lady of Perpetual Succor, which when we had Ghanese, I'm not sure how to say that, cooks and stewards, it got them really excited about it. They bought candles on shore and would always bring them and burn them in front of it. And then, so he's very proud of his chapel. He says, after the war, when the Ceylon was in action again in Korea, I had a letter from the chaplain who had just joined, and he said it was the best equipped chapel he had found in the service. And he wanted me to know that the things were still in use. He talks about an episode of Providence on page 116. It says, one day, that they had some of the non-essential personnel deciphering things. One day when I was deciphering the situation report, I got a figure wrong. The curious thing is that it was the only figure, other than the right one, in the thousands of permutations which made any sense. It was thought by the navigator to be a rather odd course, but the landings had confused the usual pattern of shipping. Next day, we were several hundred miles out of station, having sailed blithely through minefields and all manner of hazards. The curious thing was that we were the only ship to sail through the Mediterranean at that time without seeing either a plane or a submarine. And another ship, which followed the course we should have taken a few hours later, was torpedoed and sunk. So make what you like of it. So I would rank that up to Providence, I said. So the captain said, I don't know whether to recommend you for a court-martial or a medal. And he talks about the great sense of community on board the ship and kind of feeling much like a parish. And both the tight quarters and also the danger that you're in kind of are like glue that glues the community together. And also, it's like once you've been through a little bit of danger, people don't get as upset at each other as they used to. Kind of calms the nerves or distracts them, I guess. On page 118, he refers to communion in one kind. He says, the captain confided in me that he did not come to communion much because he could not bear drinking out of the chalice after other people. I explained to him that that was perfectly possible to receive the sacrament in one kind. He thought this was a terribly good idea and adopted the practice, much to the surprise of the more knowing, who thought that I must have converted him to very extreme views, which was far from the truth. Of course, in our own situation, the pandemic, communion in one kind has become widely revived and accepted, even by those that you wouldn't think so. So the REC, for example, very low church outfit, we're doing communion in one kind, no problem, really just because of the situation. We'll probably go back to having the chalice here pretty soon. Maybe Corpus Christi might be a nice thematic occasion to reintroduce that. Let's see. Well, he talks about on page 119, there was a lot of time at sea for reading and talking. Sometimes in the dark on the quarterdeck, people would open up their hearts and tell me what was really worrying them, which in daylight and other circumstances they would have found too embarrassing. I've heard many confessions leaning over the rail, watching the phosphorescent wake of the ship stream behind us like a white carpet. And it's kind of like the thing, it seems like the best conversations happen at night. And it's not so much a matter of embarrassment. I think it's also a bit of, you're sort of unwound for the day. And, you've maybe had a drink, put your hair down, you got more comfortable clothes, whatever it is. But also there's this factor of, you're in stressful situations, and it's sort of like you're kind of out of view of your regular life. I've heard many confessions leaning over the rail, watching the phosphorescent wake of this ship stream behind us. He mentions on page 120 the lady in white at Durban. So I went to look this up. So this is a woman named Perla Seidel Gibson. And so she, I think the story is something like she was originally, had a friend or maybe a suitor or something like that that was leaving, an Irishman, and she kind of serenaded him off when he went to sea. And then, I guess the other people got to experience it too, and they thought, well, that was really cool, and she had a good experience. So she decided, well, I'm going to do this every time a ship passes by here. So she kind of positioned herself out on the pier, and some Navy guys gave her a bullhorn, and so she would sing, and she was like a professional singer, So she would serenade the ships as they went out to sea, and it was kind of a thing, just like when you're an immigrant coming into New York, and you got to see the Statue of Liberty there. You got to be serenaded by the lady in white as you were going out to sea.
Sounded more like she was the ghost of the.
Yeah, I think there's a novel that has a character named Lady in White. It's like that. And then they put a statue out there after to commemorate her, and then they ended up moving that into a museum or something. And then to wrap this up on page 121, he talks about one afternoon, which seemed like any other, I joined some friends who were going to bathe, but I felt I must also go and see one of the seamen who was sick. So after I'd been in the water, I dressed and said to my companions, I'll meet you at the jetty as I'm going to the hospital. These were the truest words I've ever spoken, for after taking a shortcut through the jungle, I fell over 30 feet down a disused well, breaking both my legs, with such complications that it was almost 3 years before I got out of the various hospitals into which I landed myself. So that's where we pick up next time, chapter 9, in hospital. And we will avoid using those definite articles for hospital and university. So, thank you so much. We'll continue next time.